Saul was the first king in Israel's history, and the Bible sure makes it sound like he looked the part. If you were to open up your Bible to 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 2, it says, Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. And you get the thought that Saul seems to have been this tall, dark, handsome, mysterious type. You know, a lot like yours truly, of course. Just kidding, by the way. But even if we find in chapter 11 that Saul even powerfully rescues the city, the Israelite city of Jabesh, from enemies called the Ammonites. Now, afterwards, Saul was confirmed as Israel's king. But over time, something happens to Saul. This man of God begins to become prideful. He starts buying into kind of the press, all of these things that are being said about him. He starts buying into all of these amazing stories that he's hearing about his greatness, this great and conquering king, that eventually Saul oversteps his bounds and deeply offends God. Now, what was customary for the Israelite time then, when they were going off to war, a prophet named Samuel would come and he would offer sacrifices to God before they went to war. And Saul would participate in those offerings being offered to God. And there was this one case where Saul got tired of waiting. Samuel got held up in something, doing something. And although Saul was king, he did not have permission from God to offer sacrifices. And instead, Saul decides he's going to take matters into his own hands. He can't wait for Samuel anymore, so he offers the sacrifices. Right then and there, God becomes incredibly displeased with Saul and his pride and removes his hand of blessing from him. And he places it on another, no, I won't say man, at that point it was really a boy named David. We've talked about David in the past several weeks ago, and he was a 15-year-old shepherd. Now, Saul's job as king was to protect the Israelites from enemies, and he did so valiantly until a man named Goliath rolls around. Goliath was a Philistine warrior, and we are told when we read 1 Samuel that he was a giant, towering over 9 foot 9 inches tall. And people were a little bit shorter back in those days. We think that the average person, the average guy, would have been somewhere around 5 foot, maybe 5'2". So there would have been a giant discrepancy between the average person and Saul being a head taller than everyone. He might have been a little bit upper 5 foot, maybe at most my height. And I'm 5'11". So you think about a man that's almost the height of a basketball hoop, weighing probably close to 275, 300 pounds. A good example would be thinking of a frame like Shaquille O'Neal on somebody that's 9 foot 9 inches. And this Goliath is coming out of the Philistines' camp, challenging that any Israelite needs to take him on. Instead of the two sides going to battle, he said, let's settle this, one person, our best against your best. And that's when Saul is supposed to stand up and go to war on behalf of the Israelites. But instead, he was afraid like everyone else. So he just sat around being terrified as this giant Goliath comes out and torments the Israelites day after day. And if you know the story, David comes in, this small shepherd boy, and he can't take this anymore. He's like, who will stand up for the Israelites? And he's all enraged, and God's Spirit is on him, and he fights Goliath. He hits him with a slingshot with smooth rocks. So David takes a slingshot to a sword battle, so to speak, and he is deadly accurate with this thing. No armor. He refuses Saul's armor because it doesn't fit him and it's too big. He's too small. And yet God's hand of blessing and promise and protection was on David, and he goes and defeats Goliath. Now, soon after, so as Saul has gotten accustomed to hearing of Israel's stories of how great and awesome he is, well, since he was a coward in this instance and shaking in his boots to face Goliath, and David, this young boy, comes along and valiantly defeats Goliath, there's a song that starts getting sung around the camps, around the children and the women. And they start singing a song saying that Saul killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Now, if that wouldn't have just a little bit of a sting to it, I don't know what would. And this starts to really get under Saul's skin. It really gets up into his stuff. And it starts to torment him, slowly causing him to kind of lose his mind. The text in 1 Samuel tells us that a messenger of the Lord would come and torment Saul because his hand of blessing had been removed from him. And I am sure that this song didn't help him whatsoever. This man full of pride, thinking that he is the greatest out there, and these songs of might are being sung about another. A boy at that. Of course, it's a major pride wound to Saul, and Saul begins to attempt to kill David, and he tries to kill him in the palace several times. And after David flees, Saul devotes the rest of his life attempting to catch and kill David. He does this. He chases David for over 15 years. Think about that. Think about pride driving someone for a large portion of their life to try to kill someone else. Now, there are a lot of parallels that can kind of be taken to our own lives when we think about the things that motivate us to do different types of things. If we're on that ladder climbing journey and we want to get as high as we can, that pride of who we are and where we want to get to, that can take more than 15, 20, 30 years of our life before we wake up, if we ever wake up. Well, anyway, Saul chases David for 15 years, and he's finally killed in a battle with the Philistines, where his boys are killed slightly before him. And he falls on his own sword after he's surrounded by kind of this Philistine army. And so Saul wastes the rest of his life in pride, wanting to kill the person that has kind of stepped on his pride and his ego. At some point, Saul went from self-confident and capable, somebody under God's hand of promise, to prideful, resentful, and seemingly under the hand of the enemy. That pride stole happiness and peace from the rest of Saul's life, leaving him bitter for over 15 years until he lost everything. Even his sons and his own life included. Let that stand as a warning to us as we start to believe kind of our own press, the stuff that we either believe about ourselves or the things that other people are telling us, that we can have the same villainous fate as Saul. Saul becomes a wicked, heinous villain. He goes from prophesying God's word early in 1 Samuel 10 or so, 11. He's a man that seems to be strictly under God's influence, amazing man of God, but 4 or 5 chapters later, hunting God's promised one, the one that actually leads to Jesus. Jesus is in the line of King David. So he goes from being God's chosen to hunting God's chosen. Quite the flip. Pride can flip us just like that type of villain. So pride can make us a villain very, very quickly. But as Proverbs tell us, pride comes before destruction. And we've heard that reworded as pride comes before a fall. If that's the case, how can we know if we're being prideful or if we're being simply self-confident, right? If we can become a heinous villain and we can go from God's chosen to hunting God's chosen. So to go from the side of God, standing for his purposes, pursuing the things that he values in the world, being his son or his daughter, to being the opposite of that, to being an enemy of God, chasing after all the wrong things, being devoted to all of the wrong things, and living a miserable life, trying to undermine God's plan. If pride can be the difference between here and here, it's incredibly important that we understand the difference between self-confidence, which is a good thing, something that Saul initially had, to pride, which is a bad thing, and it will undercut everything that God stands for and everything that we want to stand for. Well, the Oxford Dictionary provides some helpful definitions for us. It defines pride as the quality of having an excessively high opinion of yourself or of your own importance. And I'm going to say that again. Pride is the quality of having an excessively high opinion of yourself or of your own importance, meaning that we believe a lot more about us and our capacities than what we can actually manifest and what we can actually bring forward. We believe that we are so much better than what we are. That's what pride is. And then we act like it, and we engage life as if we are this amazing, towering figure when perhaps we're not. Whereas the Oxford Dictionary defines self-confidence as a feeling of self-assurance of your own abilities or qualities. I'll repeat that. It defines self-confidence as a feeling of self-assurance of your own abilities or qualities. So the difference here is, one, self-confidence is a healthy thing. Going, look, I'm really good at X, Y, or Z. I'm really gifted. Perhaps you're really good in mechanics. Like me, personally, I have a thing for like working on cars or putting things together. I like to tear things apart and put them back together. I was always really good at building blocks or puzzles or math. Those were things that were my strength. And knowing that you're good at these things and stepping into them and engaging them, that's self-confidence. Where I could slide into pride is thinking, I'm better than everyone at math. No one can touch me in math. I am far superior to anyone. And at that moment, when I get to that point, no one can teach me anything. I'm the best. And once we shut our ears off to listening to others, when we shut our ears off to the guidance of others, when we are no longer a teachable spirit, that's when pride has nailed us, and that's when we're going to make gigantic mistakes. And it's when we start wanting to defend our own legacy or our own agenda. And that is where the deep downfall of pride lies. So if you are still a bit unsure if where you fall on the pride spectrum is pride versus self-confidence, if you're kind of unsure of where you fall on that spectrum, I have found a helpful 20-question quiz for us to take. And yes, we're going to take the time this morning to take this 20-question quiz together. So I'm going to invite you to pull out a piece of paper and a pen. I'm going to give you a little bit of time to do that. So please start looking for something, whether it's a cell phone app, and type it into your notes. We're going to go through a quiz together. So be looking for a pen or paper or pulling out an app on your phone or your computer or something to do this as I explain the directions for the quiz. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds or so to find some sort of scratch paper, some sort of app or whatever where you can take this quiz together. And please do that as we're going over the instructions. The quiz is from a devotional I stumbled across while preparing for the sermon. It consists of 20 statements that we need to score from never to always. So we can either say we never do something, we rarely do something, we sometimes do something, we frequently do something, or we always do something. So that's 5 different answer responses. We can either say we never do something, we rarely do something, we sometimes do something, we frequently do something, or we always do something. So there's going to be 20 statements, and you have to select whether you never, rarely, sometimes, frequently, or always that statement can pertain to you. So never gets a score of 0. If you select never, then it doesn't count as a point against you. Rarely gets a score of 2. So if you select that you rarely do this thing, it's 2 points against you. Sometimes gets a score of 3 points, frequently gets a score of 4 points, and always gets a score of 5 points. And so this is going to be, if it's kind of like golf. The lower the score, the better. If you're not a good golfer, that's okay. It shouldn't have any bearing on this test. But if you score 0 points, you might be the biggest liar on the face of the planet. So if you get a big fat 0, we know you might not have an issue of pride, but we do know that you have an issue of lying. So you better have something more than a 0. On a more serious note, you could have up to 100 points. And if you score a 100 pointer on this thing, then you might be the most proud person on the planet. I will say, I have taken this test, and I was kind of surprised at my results. I think we all have a bit more pride in ourselves than what we would like to admit. So as we delve into this quiz, answer honestly for yourself, because pride is a very dangerous thing, and we need to know if we have a problem with this or not, so we can take action steps into living into the person that God has called us to be. So the whole point of this series and the whole point of this morning is saying we want to be more Christ-like. Pride is something that prevents us from being more Christ-like. So let's identify it in ourselves so we can get over it, so we can overcome it. All right, I hope you have found that paper by now, or you have taken out an app or something so you can score this. So let's get started. Question or statement 1. In conversations, I prefer speaking about myself or having others talk about me rather than listening about other people. In conversations, I prefer speaking about myself or having others talk about me rather than listening about other people. So score that. Whether it's rarely, never, sometimes, always, we have to score that. The second statement, in most situations, I'm thinking about how things will benefit me, reflect on me, or work in my favor. In most situations, I am thinking about how things will benefit me, reflect on me, or work in my favor. We're going to be moving along fairly quickly because this ought to be more of a knee-jerk thing. Don't get hung up if you're like, oh man, I don't know what that means. I don't know what I should put down. Put down the first thing that jumps into your mind. We don't have a lot of time to go over all of this. I'll try to have it posted again online so you can, if you felt like you missed a couple, you can see it. The third statement is, if I'm honest, when making decisions, I tend to do what I think is best for me rather than what would glorify God. So if I'm honest, when making decisions, I would tend to do what I think is best for me rather than what would glorify God. Fourth, when someone says I have hurt or offended them, I tend to think that they are the one with the problem. Ouch. 4, when someone says I have hurt or offended them, I tend to think they are the one with the problem. 5, when good things happen for other people, I tend to get jealous and have a hard time being happy for them. When good things happen for other people, I tend to get jealous and have a hard time being happy for them. 6, I desire a lot of attention and affirmation. 6, I desire a lot of attention and affirmation. 7, I think I'm generally better than most people. I think I'm generally better than most people. 8, I am not a generous person and am more prone to take than to give. I am not a generous person and I am more prone to take than to give. 9, I feel like the world would be a better place if people just agreed with the way I think they should behave. 9, I feel like the world would be a better place if people just agreed with the way I think they should behave. I hear that a lot. Have you ever heard that? I've heard that a lot in conversations. 10, I have a hard time not winning, and I am an overly competitive person. I resemble that remark. 10, I have a hard time not winning, and I'm an overly competitive person. All right, this is the halfway mark. How are you all doing so far? Are you finding that this is tough? Are you finding that some of these hurt? Are you finding that, this isn't so good? I'm not doing as hot as I'd like. If you're like me, by the first half, it was like, oh man, I don't like where this is going. All right, let's keep going. Number 11, it is more common for people to serve me than for me to serve them. 11, it is more common for people to serve me than for me to serve them. 12, it bothers me when I do something good and do not receive credit for it. It bothers me when I do something good and I do not receive credit for it. 13, I have a hard time giving compliments to others, speaking well of others, and honoring others. This is an other-focused question. I have a hard time giving compliments to others, speaking well of others, and honoring others. 14, I feel like certain menial tasks are below me and should be done by someone else. 14, I feel like certain menial tasks are below me and should be done by someone else. 15, I hide my Christian convictions when I am with people who might disagree with me, judge me, or reject me. 15, I hide my Christian convictions when I am with people who might disagree with me, judge me, or reject me. All right, hold on. We're 3/4 of the way through. 16, I have a hard time taking orders, receiving correction, or being under authority. Ouch, I resemble that remark too. 16, I have a hard time taking orders, receiving correction, or being under authority. 17, I think about myself more than I think about God and other people. 17, I think about myself more than I think about God and other people. 18, I prefer to be the teacher informing others rather than the student who is learning. Remember, I talked about that. Pride comes in when we shut our ears off and we no longer want to hear. So 18, I prefer to be the teacher informing others rather than the student who is learning. Only 2 more. 19, I care a lot about how I appear to others, my appearance, possessions, and people with whom I associate. 19, I care a lot about how I appear to others, my appearance, possessions, and people with whom I associate. And 20, I tend to brag about myself, and I tend to criticize others. I tend to brag about myself, and I tend to criticize others. All right, so how did we do? What do you think? As you've gone through these 20 questions, even if you couldn't score them all, maybe this was moving a bit too fast, I'll do my best to make sure that these things are reflected well in the videos as we're going through. You should have seen all of the different questions popping up on your screen, and I'll do my best to have something posted, so if you want to retake the test under a little less duress, that you can do that. But by and large, you should be able to get a picture. If there's a lot of these 20 statements that seem to be a harsh reflection, or if you're like, man, I resemble that remark, and if you said that like 10, 15, 20 times, man, I resemble that remark, then we might be a little worse in the pride department than what we've given ourselves credit for. And if that's the case, if you were like me and you found, wow, maybe pride could be something that I wrestle with. So what do we do now? We know pride comes before destruction. We know that pride is a stumbling block that gets in the way of us being the people that God has created us to be. It gets in the way of us living into being in the image of God. It gets in the way of us being Christ-like. So what is it that we need to do to remove pride from our lives so that our lives aren't all about us, that they are other-centric, other-focused, servant-centric, servant-focused, like that of Christ, as Christ came in the world to serve others and to not be served, if that's our exemplar, Christ's ministry and how we engage, what do we have to do to get over our own pride? Now, I think there are at least 4 ways that we can begin overcoming our pride. So I'm going to rattle them off really fast and we'll get into all of them. First, I think we need to raise a personal awareness. We need to start asking ourselves if we're prideful. Second, we need to lighten up. Third, we must engage real dialogue. And finally, we have to draw closer to God. Raising personal awareness means that we have to start looking for pride in ourselves. We can turn a blind eye to almost anything in life. So if we don't start delving in and digging in and doing some self-evaluation, like taking that quiz seriously and looking, Lord, do I have some pride issues? Are there things that are getting in the way of me serving you in the way that I should? We have to start looking for pride in ourselves. And pride is one of those things that we have a hard time seeing. So we're going to have to invite others into that conversation with us to hold us accountable. So find a friend, maybe a spouse or a brother or sister or a parent or somebody that's close to you, a best friend, to invite into your life to hold you accountable when it comes to pride, especially if you feel like this is an area that you might struggle in. So we have to raise our personal awareness so that we can begin to combat pride with our lives. If we don't realize it's a battle, we can't engage, right? Secondly, we have to lighten up. We can't take things too seriously. And the year 2020 is giving us fits. It's making it hard for us to lighten up, to take things a little bit less seriously. So it might also be demonstrating that we have more nationally a pride problem. So we must know what we can change. We must know what we can change and where we have to engage, and then we have to let God handle the things that we can't. That's going to help us lighten up. It's going to help us to not take everything so seriously. So if we start taking everything too seriously, that begins to flow into ourselves, and we start to take ourselves too seriously, and we begin to feel like we've been wronged or falsely accused or somebody's after us when really they're not. And that's because we have this puffed up image of ourselves. We have a puffed up thought about our self-worth. So when we take everything too seriously, it starts to penetrate into us taking ourselves too seriously, which means that we're being prideful. Pride often comes from a fear of failure. I'm going to say that again. Pride often comes from a fear of failure. So if we fail, we're concerned other people are going to see that. What we have to do is we must realize it's okay for others to see us fail. They have failed. The other people have failed. If you say you have never failed, you are a liar. We have all failed. There are videos out there probably of when you were trying to learn how to walk. I have 2 little kids that are in the process of learning how to crawl and learning how to stand. Guess what? They fail a lot. They're not very good at it. There was once a time when you didn't know how to walk. You failed a lot. We all fail. That's part of being human. So we must realize that it's okay for others to see us fail. And then we have to laugh it off, get back on the horse and go after it again. We have to lighten up. We can't take ourselves too seriously, or we have a puffed up image of ourselves, a puffed up understanding. Thirdly, we must have real dialogue with people. So by that I mean we can't be imposing our will on other people in conversations. We can't be bringing our own personal agenda into every conversation when we have. And I look at politics today as this type of thing. The Republican side and the Democrat side, we're not really trying to convince each other to think differently. We're just trying to really slam our thoughts and opinions and processes down the other person. We're trying to kind of crush them with our way of thinking. If we can get more power on our side, then we can overtake it. It's just an overtaking. It's almost oppressive in that type of a way. We don't really want to honor the other person. We don't really want to honor the other side. We don't really want to open our ears and listen and have true dialogue and convince someone of our position. We want to overpower them. We want to overtake them. That's the American way. That's just what we do. And we carry that type of persona, that type of attitude into every normal day conversations too, where our ears are shut off. We're not honoring the other person in the conversation. We don't have a teachable heart and a teachable spirit, so we have to learn how to engage real dialogue. It shouldn't be monological. We shouldn't be the one talking all the time. We shouldn't be telling the other person how to think all the time. What we have to do is learn how to listen first, and then if we're going to talk, ask clarifying questions. So saying things like, so I hear you saying this. Well, why do you believe that? And then if you want to get really spicy, ask something like, have you ever considered? And this is opening up pathways of learning so that we can learn the other person's perspective. And in dialogue, we both have the opportunity to change. It's a wonderful thing. We both have the opportunity to be conformed closer into the image of God. None of us are 100% right all the time. Sad fact, I hate to break the news to you, we're all wrong about some things. So if we never have real dialogue with people, we'll never have a chance to have real change. And we all need real change. So we need to commit to having real dialogue. And finally, we have to draw closer to God. God has true humility. When we look at the person of Christ and what he did, laid himself down to take on human flesh, and then not only did that, served a bunch of fishermen and tax collectors and prostitutes, washed their feet, took the lowliest of lowly positions, and then was sacrificed on a cursed cross for their sake and ours. We have an example of someone who knows what it means to sacrifice and what it means to be humble. So we have to draw closer to him so that we can learn from him what it means to do that. That means spending more time in prayer on our knees, confessing the things that we don't do well, asking for help. These are both things that create humility in our lives and knock us down a step from our pride. And engaging God regularly, realizing that it's not my personal agenda at the end of the day, it's his. It's about his kingdom, about his glory, and how my gifts fit into his grand picture, his grand purposes. Life's not about accumulating everything for me, but for others, so that others can know more about who God is and the eternity that is offered to them about being in his presence forever and ever. When we are overly prideful, we get in the way of people's eternity forever and ever, and then we are one of the greatest villains on the planet. So friends, I encourage you, deeply encourage you, do some self-examining. Look for pride. When we're prideful, we put a stumbling block in front of others in their quest for finding purpose and meaning in the kingdom of God.